Stanford University.
Thank you, Dan. I have to say I'm a little bit intimidated. I have a sense that there are quite a few people in this audience who know a significant amount more than I do about various aspects of the future of nuclear power. And I thought what I would do today is really to try to give you some very high-level impressions about what I think the impact of Fukushima is going to be and not be, and put forward a couple of controversial propositions, and then see if we can get some discussion going. My first proposition is that, contrary to what might seem conventional wisdom, that no matter how terrible the Fukushima disaster was, it's actually going to end up having very little impact on the future of nuclear power anywhere, except perhaps in Japan. And I say that because if you look around the world and look at this regionally and by country, clearly in Europe it's had a significant impact in Germany, Switzerland. A few countries are going to scale back or phase out with nuclear, at least they say they are now. But the other side of that is that the history of nuclear in some of these countries has been a political football for a long time. And I would suggest that in 5 or 7 years it's possible, when the Germans look at where they're buying their electricity from French nuclear plants right over the border and from Polish coal plants, that the politics might swing back. And we'll look back and say, what happened in Fukushima is not that important. And in other European countries like the UK and certainly France, it's not going to have a significant impact. In the places where nuclear is really booming, the growth of this industry is going to be in China, North Korea, Russia. Both China and Russia, and to some extent North Korea, are very determined to become net exporters and begin to sell nuclear power plants to the rest of the world. And in India, all of those places where the real growth is going to occur, Fukushima may have caused some course correction, but probably those programs are going to go forward very aggressively. And I want to come back and talk about China a little bit, because Dan and I were just involved in June in helping to organize with NRDC and some Chinese trade associations and other nonprofits, the Energy Foundation, a 2-day conference workshop in Beijing on the prospects for a Chinese nuclear safety regime, regulatory regime, or lack thereof. So in those countries, I think the program's going to go forward. And in the United States, we are not going to have a renaissance of nuclear power in the next 10 to 12 to 13 years, because compared even more to 4 or 5 years ago, today nuclear really can't compete on price. Talking a little bit about why that is, very often people who compare the different costs of electrical production use this analytical formula called the levelized cost of electricity, which is an attempt to do almost a life cycle analysis over usually 30 years, capital cost, operating costs, and other risks, and to try to identify and compare and contrast what it costs today if you are prepared to make a 30-year investment. And in the last few years, most of the analyses, including analysis by the Energy Information Administration of DOE, have shown that the levelized cost of electricity for nuclear, new nuclear, is not all that much higher than for a new combined cycle natural gas plant or maybe advanced coal without carbon capture and storage. So roughly those numbers, if you looked a year or two ago at these analyses, you'd see that maybe pulverized coal levelized cost 5.5, 6 cents a kilowatt hour. Combined cycle natural gas, maybe 6.5 cents. And nuclear sometimes came in at 7. 8 to 13 is the more recent span. So that's without any kind of a carbon price. That's without climate regime. If you then say, well, in 5 or 10 years, you have to add to the cost of a gas plant or a coal plant $25 a ton cost of carbon emissions, nuclear looks to be in the zone of competitiveness, but it's not. And the reason it's not is because of the size and the risks involved in the upfront capital cost of nuclear. So very rough figures, 1,000 megawatt nuclear plant, capital cost $5 billion. A 1,000 megawatt combined cycle natural gas plant, $1 billion. So the nuclear plant costs today, overnight capital cost, about 5 times as much. And you have to build a big nuclear plant, but you can build a 200 or a 400 or a 500 megawatt gas plant. So the gas plants can be smaller, but involve a very small fraction of the total capital. A gas plant you can probably build in 2.5 years. After 2 years you're going to be successful in building it. It's going to begin to pay your capital investment back. A nuclear plant, pre-3 Mile Island, 5 years, 6 years, now as much as 9, 10, 11 years to build a nuclear plant. So it's going to be a decade before your capital begins to generate any kind of a return. And the licensing and regulatory risk over that 10-year period, the risk that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission may come up with something in 6 years that has to be retrofit into your plant or change the rules, that's something a lender has to think hard about. It's not the case in a gas plant. And the fact that local opposition to the plant may crystallize over that period and delay or prevent the plant from opening. Those are all risks that lenders have to take into account. And there's the capital escalation, potential capital escalation. So MIT's big study on the future of nuclear power in 2003, there was an update in 2009 and basically said the cost of a nuclear plant has roughly doubled in 10 years. So if you are thinking about making that $5 billion investment versus a $500 million investment in a 2-year, 500 megawatt gas plant, that's an easy investment choice. And I think that the lack of competitiveness on the part of new nuclear is illustrated by the fact that in 2005, in the Energy Act, Congress set up a loan guarantee program, DOE loan guarantee program, that was targeted in some large part then in nuclear and clean coal. Even though there are over 20 license applications technically filed for new nuclear plants with the NRC, only about 5 or 6 of those applicants really were at the stage where they could try to go for a loan guarantee. In the end, only 3 really made it very far through the process. And there's probably federal money to make loan guarantees to 3 of those plants. 1 made it over the finish line, has a closed guarantee. Southern Company is going to build a plant. But the other 2, in the last 6 months, abandoned their applications. The NRG and its partner just bailed out within months before they got their loan guarantee. And Constellation, which was in a deal with the French, is going to be acquired by Exelon. So they're a nuclear utility going to be acquired by the biggest nuclear utility in the country, will be combined, even a bigger nuclear utility. They also abandoned their application. And one of the people in charge, I was saying this morning, told me last week, when it came down to it, OMB wanted a credit payment, credit subsidy payment of 13.9% of the loan. So 13.9% of $4 billion is quite a lot of money. And he said that was about 140% of the entire profit on the project. So Lindra's credit default cost was 3%. So here you have a situation which the federal government is leaning over as far as it can. Price Anderson, we are the insurer of last resort. We will make you a loan guarantee, and even with that kind of subsidy, nobody is prepared to lend the money to do new nuclear today in the United States. It's unclear what the NRC is going to do in its regulatory program about the lessons learned from Fukushima. I don't think it's going to do a lot, because I think there's an impression in the nuclear community and in the public to some degree that what happened there is not that relevant to the US program. First of all, we don't have tsunamis. Second, there's not a huge fear that, although there are plants on faults and we're going to have to look at that we don't have a major problem from earthquakes in this country. I think that's a general public perception and probably shared within the NRC. And third, some of the things that happened in Fukushima with fire and the fuel pools are potential risks that the NRC has already addressed over the last 10 years in the wake of 9/11. NRC looked after 9/11 and, you know, what happens if a 747 crashes into a nuclear plant and goes into the fuel pool, and there's fire and lack of water and system power stays off. So US operators have been required, it took a long time, but have been required to take some measures to deal with those kinds of issues already. I personally think that Fukushima actually exposes some fairly serious systemic flaws in the way we do our probabilistic risk analysis of nuclear plants. And I say that because if you think about catastrophe as being a combination of hazard and vulnerability, an overlay of the hazard and then the vulnerability to the hazard. We have had a program now for many decades that focuses on a very sophisticated probabilistic analysis of what's necessary to cope with a broad range of design basis accidents. So if you imagine a design basis accident, the reactor has to be designed to at least withstand 10 to the minus 6 chance of something happening. That's a lot of defense in depth for the design basis accidents. But of course, in Japan, the tsunami wave was not a design basis accident. And we find out now that in the US system, reactors have been required now for many decades only to be able to back up 4 to 8 hours of total loss of system power. And that's clearly utterly inadequate. So that's a big blind spot. We did a good job on the vulnerability, but extending the hazard and saying, well, what if some combination of circumstances, not a tsunami, not an earthquake, would cause a US plant to lose power for a day and a half? And you didn't have at least a 10 to the minus 2 or 10 to the minus 3 set of backups for that non-design basis accident. We know from 3 Mile Island, and we now know from Fukushima, that even a day, 24 hours of loss of power, which truly causes loss of circulation, and boiling off of water can cause a partial core meltdown. So I think in terms of what our regulators ought to be saying to our operators about Fukushima and the lessons learned, loss of system power, the vulnerability of spent fuel pools, which turn out in the US are often chock full of much more radioactivity in total than at Fukushima. Those are not in reactor vessels, they're not in containment structures, they're sitting there in the open, and they can drain and they can burn, and if they do, then you have a completely uncontrolled release. Hydrogen gas buildup. So there are 3 or 4 or 5 critical issues here that I think the NRC should, over time at least, and certainly in plants that are being relicensed, should require some significant changes that will be costly. But the point I'm making in my principal proposition here is, even without any of those changes and without any additional cost, nuclear isn't going to be cost competitive in the United States for the next 10 years. So we're not going to have any more. What about China? China is probably on track to, by 2015 or 2016, building 60 or 70 nuclear plants simultaneously, all different designs, old designs, new indigenous designs, new somewhat advanced, slightly advanced designs like the Westinghouse AP1000, which they bought a lot of, Russian designs, Korean designs. China has no nuclear safety law, and they don't have any nuclear safety agency. And probably have no prospect, since they have no history over the last, this is not just the Communist Party, over the last 2,000 years, they have no history of ever having an independent government regulatory agency, independent of the government power structure. So in a Western model, if you think, as most of us do, that critical part of having a nuclear program with a true safety culture is having at least an independent regulatory agency in the government with funding, expertise, clout, can make operators do something or close a plant if they're not. That's not going to happen in China. And one of the reasons that it's not going to happen is that with all the money that they're going to be spending, there are so many segments within the party and the government hierarchy that want a piece of that. Let's say 60 reactors times $4 billion, $240 billion, that's a lot of money people want to get their hands on. And so you have at least 3, probably 4 major competing power structures within the party, each represented by a separate ministry, each competing to be the lead agency to administer the program, and therefore have the first shot at the dollars. So I think the prospect is of one agency getting accountability and getting authority of having a law that then assigns that agency the responsibility for administering the program. That's just not going to happen. So in China, the challenge, and the program's going to go ahead anyway. The challenge in China clearly is, how do you take a non-Western system? What are the pieces of systems that you need to have to create a safety culture in that program? The reactors are going to end up being constructed and operated, or at least the construction supervised and operated by 2, 3, probably 4 major power companies, 1 new and 3 of the old 5, by 1 or 2 construction companies doing the construction. And each of these is in effect a super ministry because they're all government-owned entities. And so you're going to have the operators who are ultimately going to control the safety culture. Now in the US, I think one of the things that's made our nuclear program a lot safer since 3 Mile Island is not only that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission strengthened somewhat, but the industry said we can't afford another 3 Mile Island. And so the industry got together and formed its own industry group, Independent Nuclear INPO, Nuclear Power Operations, which is a self-policing organization. They do their own inspections of every plant every year, outside experts, but also people from other operators, and they give you a rating, 1 to 5. And if you get a 5, you're in good shape. That's the high number. If you get a 1 or a 2, you're in bad shape because you may not be able to get insurance anymore, and you know the NRC is going to come calling. Because if your peers gave you a low grade, something's going wrong, right? And the result of the INPO system has been significantly increased utilization rates. So Indian Point, for example, when it was run by the New York Power Authority 10 years ago, was operating about 67% of the time. They sold it to Energy. Now it's 93% of the time. So INPO has had the industry itself has had an important impact. With increased productivity goes increased safety. The two are really hand in hand. And so I think this is one of the very few examples of successful environmental safety or environmental self-regulation in the United States. Not very common if you look at certain other industries, offshore drilling and so forth. But the nuclear industry really has done something very important in this self-regulatory process. How do you take that and import it to China? That's really the challenge. There is an international INPO called WANO, World Association of Nuclear Operators. Every nuclear operator in the world belongs, but it's understaffed, and it needs somehow with other international organizations to help the Chinese develop the same program. So it was last week, WANO had a meeting in China, and the members agreed to commit very substantial additional resources to WANO. And if those resources are committed over the next 3 or 4 years, WANO will be in a position to have 0.6 FTEs, 0.6 full-time FTEs, people for each reactor in the world. INPO has 4.8 FTEs for every American reactor. So that tells you something about the gap. So that's China. The other thing that China's doing that's really very interesting is they're beginning to build the advanced designs, including a pebble bed reactor, that have been around, which are by and large US technology, US designs, that have been around for 25 or 35 years, but have never been built in the United States. And in fact, there isn't a single utility or investor who's willing to put up one of these advanced designs for license, for design certification at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, because our regulatory system is so fixated on a probabilistic risk assessment expensive process that's grown up over the years, looking at existing plants and existing systems, that nobody wants to spend the money to put forward into the licensing process something that isn't a marginal or an iterative improvement. Something brand new, we don't even have a system to evaluate. So nobody wants to spend a few $100 million to go to the NRC with one of these supposedly passively safe designs. But the Chinese, and perhaps the Koreans and the Russians, are going to build some of these designs. And so, in 5, 7, 8 years, it may be, after all, in the US, we're still operating on designs that are 40, 45 years old. The last reactor built in the United States was proposed in 1970 and completed in 1996. So you're talking a 40, 45-year-old design. That's where we still are today, with modest improvements in the operating system. If the Chinese or others outside of the US build smaller, passively safe, truly advanced designs, then I think they will own the market. I'm looking at the time and thinking we'll want to leave some time for questions, but let me advance one other controversial proposition for you, and that is that we actually don't need new nuclear in this country for the next 10 to 15 years, and probably don't even want it. And I'll come back to the link to the Chinese. So we're going to, we have a wasteland of climate policy here. We have no climate policy. We have no energy policy. We've utterly failed to enact any legislation in the last 5 or 6 years that deals with these issues. Nonetheless, the United States is going to meet its Waxman-Markey greenhouse gas emission goals in 2020, as if we had enacted the law. So without having a policy, in the next 10 years, we're on track to do very well. Why is that? Well, number one, EPA has brought out or about to bring out a number of regulations to reduce emissions of conventional pollutants, criteria pollutants, SOx, NOx, principally mercury, acid gases. And the net result of those regulations on old coal plants is about 20% or more of the old coal plants are going to have to be decommissioned by 2016 because it's too expensive to put controls, particularly for mercury and these other pollutants on them. So you're going to have a significant decarbonization of the electrical generating segment of the economy between now and 2018, 2019. That's number one. Number two, gas is cheap. It looks like gas, regardless of what happens with fracking controversy and regulation, we're going to frack gas, we're going to produce cheap gas for quite a long time, it appears. And out there in the Midwest, where these coal plants are going to be decommissioned, are sitting a lot of gas plants that are operating at 35 to 37 to 39% of the time. So they're going to start operating at 50% of the time. And that cuts emissions by, there's a new dispute about that, but let's say at least 50% carbon dioxide emissions. Renewables is going to take up some of that slack too. Demand for electricity is much reduced. Looks like, if you take certainly 2007, 2008, it's gone down, now it's coming up, but it's not likely that the demand for electricity is going to increase over this 10-year period, let's say 2007 to 2017, more than 0.5%, 1/3%, maybe less, maybe zero. And energy efficiency, the more energy efficiency kicks in demand response, the more we're going to keep the demand for electricity flat instead of a 1% or 1.2 or 1.3% increase a year, which is what people were looking at in predicting in 2006, 2007. And we've done a really good job on cars, on tailpipe emissions and fuel efficiency. So the net result of all that, plus some stimulus dollars that for a couple of years, stimulated some wind and solar, and may be disappearing, but rooftop solar is going to continue to grow 25, 30% a year, maybe more. The net result of all that is we're going to do great on our Waxman-Markey goals for 10 years from now. We don't need any nuclear to do that. The problem is we're not making the real investments without the policy drivers. We're not making the real investments in the next 10 years to meet our goals in 2030 and 2040. So we're kicking the can down the road. By accident, we're going to be sort of all right for 10 years. And my proposition to you would be that, after 12 or 13 years, when we really need some new nuclear, both to replace existing plants, some of which will not get license extensions or will be going out of service for other reasons, when we're going to need new nuclear, the chances are that the Chinese are going to have, or the Koreans, or possibly even the Russians, or the South Africans, are going to have designed and built and demonstrated passively safe designs and or smaller modular reactors, 150, 250 megawatt reactors that are simple and cheap to build and safer, and that we in the United States are simply going to be buying our reactors, all of our nuclear reactors from the Chinese. Indeed, everybody in the world will be buying their reactors from the Chinese. At that point, further prediction, our regulatory regime, which doesn't fit that model at all, is going to be forced to be overhauled in some way or another. The market is going to force, we're going to want to buy these. Everybody else is buying them. They're 100 times safer than our current design. They're cheaper, cookie cutter, put them on existing sites. We're going to want to buy these things. We're going to want to get them licensed and constructed. The market is going to force a major overhaul for the first time in 45 years in our nuclear licensing system in order to accommodate what's actually happening technologically in technology in the market. And then we'll have our new nuclear. We might have had it 20 years ago. We might have gone to a new generation of nuclear, new designs, a new program 20 years ago, but we didn't. So somebody else is going to get us, other people are getting out in front, and we're going to buy it. We're going to have it, but we're going to buy it from them. And they're going to own the market. So that's a prediction about the future of nuclear. Intended, I hope, to try to get some people to challenge me on this and disagree.
So before we get started with questions, let me first thank George for a great introductory set of remarks. He gave a great talk this morning in our Clean Tech class, a joint law school, business school class in front of 85 students. He gave a great talk at lunch, so you've been busy today, and we very much appreciate it.
And if any, thank you. If anybody's heard the talk 3 times, I apologize.
I'm the only one, and it's been great. So I'm going to ask the first question, then we're going to turn to students. George, one other piece of this that would be useful to give us some brief thoughts about, and that is, where does nuclear waste fit into all of this? We tried and failed to build the upper mountain, and we've tried to build another regard. What about waste?
Well, Dan and I talked about this, but interesting because we've talked about why in the 70s and early 80s, when we were both in the environmental community, that community was so successful, along with the anti-proliferation community, of completely putting the kibosh on reprocessing in this country, which is one way we're going to deal with waste. The other way we're going to deal with waste is a depository, permanent depository. My theory about that is it was largely politically and psychologically driven, and bore no relationship to the science or engineering of waste disposal. And it was, when nuclear was considered to be totally safe, in the early days of the program, we really wanted to convince people that you didn't have to manage this waste and move it from one place to another, and you'd have security and you'd have transportation, and we just take it right out of the reactor and stick it in the ground, deep in the ground, and forget about it for 100,000 years. And of course, that bears no relationship to the real scientific challenge, because high-level nuclear waste sort of really has to go through the first 5 years and then the next 20 years, and then it's a lot easier to deal with. So we've ended up frozen with the fuel rods in pools. And of course, we could go to reprocessing. Dan and we talked this morning about the likelihood of that being very slim. A change in public attitude toward fuel reprocessing. But this is a technologically soluble problem. And as Dan says, if we could find we can keep putting the fuel rods in pools and do much more dry cast storage and then move it to someplace. Technologically, short of reprocessing, there's a way that we can deal with this. And somebody asked me this morning, it was interesting, how people do risk analysis of a 10-year investment in a nuclear plant. So you do the levelized cost of electricity analysis, and you say, well, here's what it costs to build the plant, and here's an interest factor, and here are all the costs for risks that a lender has to incur. How much is added into the risk for the problem that the fuel we won't find a solution to the fuel problem? And I think the answer is virtually none. People either aren't that worried about it because we've sort of stumbled along, or think that there will be technological and logistical solutions. But we really have pursued strategies, dropped strategies, and pursued strategies almost more for political reasons than for scientific and engineering reasons. And that's coming back to bite us.
All right, a student, right in the back.
The self-regulation in the U.S.
Stand up if you don't mind.
The self-regulation in the U.S. is, they have an incentive to do so because one accident or violation in one site hurts the industry as a whole because of the regulatory regime, and so they have the incentive to do so. But I'm less convinced that one accident or one violation in China is going to halt its 70 or 80 nuclear reactor addition a year. So, so my question to you is, how convinced are you that that is the system that the Chinese nuclear operators want, or whether it will be effective there? Because
well, I would say this. I think they're going ahead with their program just like they're going ahead with lots more hydro and more renewables and everything, because they need to grow every contribution that they can to energy production, and they are really concerned about air pollution and decarbonization. So the program is going to go forward. How concerned are they about safety? We got some feedback around the time of this conference from U.S. Embassy people in Beijing who said the Chinese had been coming to them looking for help and assistance and advice. And the sort of backdrop of this was that the Chinese leadership looked at Japan and said, gee, the Japanese people were pretty tolerant about this. If this had happened in China, we would either be in jail or we'd have been shot. The regime would have fallen. So the suggestion is that the Chinese don't think they can afford a nuclear accident like Fukushima and want to figure out what to do about it. Question is, you know, given the way they build and the way they operate things, what are the institutional arrangements necessary for the government to make sure that these 3 or 4, in effect, government ministries, separate government ministries who become the operators, actually are able to build a safety culture, do the construction right, and operate right? Now, there are the U.S. companies, Exelon, Duke Power, they're going into China, they're saying, we'll do this for you. It's starting with your senior management, we'll do leadership training for the CEO of the power company all the way down, operator training, operational culture. A lot of it's about management culture and corporate values, not just about, you know, turning levers. So there are people who know how to do this in the U.S., in France, and hopefully the Chinese will be very aggressive at the government level and the power and the operator level, which of course are just 2 levels of the government really, in reaching out and getting advice and help to do that. But I think that they have to depend on a beefed up WANO and their own sort of INPO on the strength of the corporate culture of these operating companies to create what, in a Western sense, we think, you know, is required, which is an independent safety agency pushing the operators. That's just not going to happen in China. Yes?
Can you comment on the Indian scenario of building nuclear power plants and what differences and similarities with China it might be if they decide to go ahead with the development of nuclear?
I think you may know more. I don't pretend to be much of an expert in India. I know that you know, this has been a little bit of a shock for India. In India, they do have, you know, the Indians do purport to have and want to have an independent regulatory, more of a, quote, Western-style independent regulatory agency. Unlike the Chinese, which have an agency which has, you know, 300, 400, 500 people in it. In India, there is a nuclear regulatory agency, but the people who've been associated with it in the recent past, including the most recent director, you know, are very negative and caustic about the capability of the current governmental regulatory regime to really do its job right. But I think, you know, a little bit like China, I think it's likely that India will go forward and carry out a very aggressive program because, again, similar to China, it needs energy and needs energy from every conceivable source. Yes?
So I have a couple of points. First, I think you're being too hard on the Chinese. I think they will. In fact, they just recently announced that they will actually be seriously trying to mimic a nuclear regulatory commission, and that local districts will have some control and say over what happens with nuclear plants built in their regions. So I think that's a little, I think that needs to be looked at a little more generally in terms of how China is actually sentient to the problem. But it's always been interesting to me how the psychology of nuclear power is more powerful than the fact that PG&E has been allowed to blow up 8 people in San Bruno this past year. And they just blew up a gas pipeline here on Page Mill Road, fortunately in test. But no one seems to care. No one seems to care that there are, if you plot the number of people killed by gas distribution every year, it is far more than were killed in total by
I said this morning, the psychology of this is very interesting.
Right.
I have this argument with my wife.
Right.
She says,
So,
I don't want nuclear, I want to get rid of nuclear.
So here's
I said,
my point.
go ahead, sorry.
So, India, we trained a lot of Indians. I went to school at Stanford, graduate school with a lot of Indians. We trained them, we sent them back. We trained a lot of Chinese, sent them back. So the question is, because we have a recession, and we're going to meet the Markey criteria for emissions, which are really, I mean, that's baby stuff. That's not real emissions. But we're going to meet it by 2017. And then what's going to happen to our balance of payments? We have to buy reactors from China. Isn't that silly? I sent you by email, I think before this, a 1962 report to JFK. Did you
Yeah.
have to read it? Okay. So that report said that by the year 2000, we were not to have any more reactors the way we have now. The water-cooled, explosive, the overheating, solid fuel waste, all that kind of stuff. We were supposed to have breeder reactors. And that never got done. The Chinese are now doing it. They committed $1 billion this year on the occasion of the Chinese New Year. And the former son, not the former son, still the son of the former premier, is in charge of it. And they're doing thorium molten salt reactors, which are passively safe. And that's what the Indians are doing. And that's what the U.S. military is now working to do, because they need forward command and control power. We kill more Marines and Army folks protecting liquid fuel transports in Iraq than fighting. Right?
Well, you're right. Every energy
So-
source has health costs and risks. And, you know, even if you accept the most conservative EPA figures, coal plants are killing hundreds of thousands of people a year. Nuclear is not killing anybody.
The game is a typical bureaucratic game. You don't charge the coal plants and the gas plants for normally occurring radioactive material, but they're allowed to emit them. It's 100 times more than the worst nuclear plant could emit.
So do you have a question? Or
Yeah, so my question is, why are we still talking about after 1962 and working programs in the 1960s at Oak Ridge National Lab, why are we still satisfied to talk about the current type of reactors as being a problem?
Well,
Why
3
are
Mile Island is one answer. You know, we after 3 Mile Island, no new reactors were ordered and over 100 were canceled. So if it hadn't been for 3 Mile Island, we could have 200 reactors instead of 104, and we could be generating 40% of our electricity with existing designs. But the freeze left the whole industry in a situation in which, and the licensing process is I think significantly to blame for this. The idea that nobody will bring an advanced design, a passively safe design forward for the last 20 years in the United States, because investing the money just to get the design approved or certified once there was a design certification system in NRC licensing, that nobody's even proposing to bring forward for government approval, and the government, of course, hasn't co-sponsored it either. Any of these advanced designs means that we have been sitting here for 25 years with these 40-year-old operating designs, and somebody else is going to build them. You're right about the thorium reactor. The Chinese. The other thing is the Chinese. A couple of years ago, their plan was, starting in 2020, they were going to go mostly to fast breeder reactors and generate their own fuel because they don't have uranium. Now, it's not clear that they may be backing off that a little bit because they have gone out aggressively to Russia and Africa and Australia to get 30-year uranium supply contracts. So they may be a little less concerned about that. But it's clear that they will build several different Generation 4 or advanced designs of one kind or another. They may build the first small modular reactors of a somewhat different design, and they will be, or the Koreans and the Russians will be, the only people making a market. And I've heard now Jim Rogers, the CEO of Duke Energy, say several times in the last year, why should I order a nuclear plant from a U.S. company? I'm waiting a few years. Once the Chinese build a couple of these AP1000s and get the cost down 30 or 35%, I'll order, I'm going to order it from the Chinese. They know how to build them. They know how to do it cost effectively. Of course I'm going to buy Chinese reactors.
As you probably know, we stumbled when it came to breeder reactors at the Clinch River project in Tennessee.
Right.
So
We chose the wrong breeder. There was an office, a fast breeder reactor design set up. There was no office.
Can we move to another question, please?
Yeah, another question? Yes.
I just would want you to comment a little bit about the proliferation issue and the connection with nuclear weapons and, with the waste, especially looking at it globally. I can understand if you look at the US and probably European countries, it's kind of under control, but considering nuclear being spread, power being spread to more not as stable countries.
You know, I'd be interesting to ask Dan and others too. I have the sense that the proliferation risk issue is a little bit reduced in the public consciousness compared to 10 or 20 years ago. Maybe because we have a lot of countries building reactors, and the chance that somehow weapons grade material is going to be stolen from a state reactor, state-run reactor, seems like a little, on the total range of terrorist risks, seems a little bit less perhaps than it did 20 years ago. And yet, I don't think the US is going to move to fuel reprocessing, and it was really the concern about proliferation risk that put the kibosh on our doing this a quarter century ago. Does a program like the Chinese program, 100 new reactors, lots of ethnic groups and community, people who might want to grab weapons grade material and run off with it, pose an additional proliferation risk? I think it does. I mean, potentially, that's an interesting discussion to have. The Russians held and hold all their, when there was a KGB, the KGB had control of the nuclear weapons in Russia, and the warheads were always separated by and large from the missiles. And this was largely because they were afraid that other ethnic groups would get their hands on a nuclear missile and turn around and fire it at Moscow, or threaten to fire it in Moscow. I don't know what the relationship, if any, will be between Chinese desire to continue to consolidate political power on the one hand and 100 nuclear reactors spread around the country. That may be perceived by some people as a proliferation risk. But I have the impression that as nuclear has grown, the proliferation risk as in the panoply of risks from nuclear has decreased in the public consciousness. Yes?
So you argued that there were really two barriers to much in the way of additional nuclear power in this country. One was the financing issues, and two is the regulatory burden of certifying a new design. And those certainly seem like plausible arguments. But so my question is, what's different in places that are able to go ahead? So if you look at China or France or India, is it that government entities are making the investments and therefore private financial assessments don't come into the picture, or is it really I'm trying to separate the regulatory issues from the financial issues. And even if we had the regulatory issues all sorted out in this country, would you be able to finance one of these things?
No. But I think what's different in China or North Korea, it is both. I mean, you have government entities, you have power companies. The government tells a Chinese bank to loan $4 billion to a Chinese power company to build a reactor, and you multiply that by 30 or 40, and the government does that. Ultimately, it's a planned economy and a centralized economy, and they have enough money to finance whatever they decide to finance. So it gets financed, just like their stimulus program. There doesn't have to be any expectation that this money will get paid back. Some people are saying that 50% of the money that Chinese banks have loaned in the last 18 months as part of their stimulus program are non-performing loans already. They'll never get paid back. Private finance would never do this on a market basis. So the fact that they have the money and they're willing to commit it as part of a state program without looking at what the chances are of repayment, because they have larger goals, namely to decarbonize their energy program, generate more energy, and develop and be own the world market for nuclear. It's not your 9% return on your loan. It's those other things that drive. But of course, the fact that they don't have a 5 or 7 year licensing, gauntlet to run, or 8 years is obviously, equally important or tied into that. In this country, I think if we had a truly streamlined licensing program, that would make some considerable difference. But I don't know that it would be, I don't think it would be determinative. The inability to finance comes from the inherent size of the investment. Risks include fabrication risk as well as licensing risk at the NRC, but regulatory risk in terms of local communities being opposed. Governor Cuomo has no authority to prevent Indian Point from getting relicensed, but he's trying as hard as he can to do it. And that's a local regulatory risk. And you have the fact that these are complicated designs and they're big, and you can build, as long as gas is cheap, and you can build a small gas plant in 2 years, and you know it's going to get built in 24 months and it's going to work, and about what it's going to cost you and what the return's going to be. Even if the licensing process, the NRC regulatory risk were taken out of this 90%, I don't think nuclear could compete, even under those circumstances. Yes, in the back?
So 2 quick questions. Could you make a prediction about the likelihood of a $25 per ton of carbon tax in the U.S.?
Go for it, George.
You got a pretty wide range on the cost of nuclear. I think you said anything from 7 to 12 cents a kilowatt hour. Why such a wide range?
Yeah, I mean, I think the chances we're going to have a carbon tax or a cap and trade program in the next 3 or 4 years are negligible. I do think that EPA is planning to put on the table something they're going to swear up and down is not carbon trading, it's not cap and trade. For the utility sector, it's going to be cap and trade. And the industry desperately wants cap and trade, because if the choice is cap or cap and trade, you're going to take cap and trade in a heartbeat, right? So I think that even though the Clean Air Act is an awfully blunt and certainly not an agile tool to use, that unless Congress steps in the way of this, which is not unlikely, that under the Clean Air Act, EPA is going to develop a cap and trade system for starting with the utility, the power generation sector, and moving to, refineries, cement, aluminum, steel. So we may end up with a cap and trade system under the Clean Air Act in 4 or 5 years. That's probably what we should have aimed for originally in the Congress, I think, 6 years ago. But the idea that we're going to have a $25 sort of economy-wide price on carbon in the near future, either through this system or legislation, I wouldn't, put 3 or 4% likelihood on that myself. Yes.
Would you like to comment on the use of nuclear energy for space exploration or space, other applications or anything for satellites or anything? What do you think?
I honestly do not know enough about very small nuclear for those kinds of applications, whether it's small submarines or spacecraft.
NASA had used nuclear small rate in the beginning, but afterwards, due to the several objections, it is stopped. But what do you think in the future?
I think it's a completely different set of issues from power generation.
On the ground.
But I do think that, you run into the fears that people have about nuclear and the unique danger and long-lived, persistent danger from radioactive substances or emission, or something goes wrong, a satellite blows up, all of North America is covered with, whatever it is. Those are strong. As we said, 3 Mile Island is a counter example to my proposition that in the end, the future of nuclear isn't going to be, in the world at large, isn't going to be significantly impacted by mass public withdrawal from nuclear power. Because after all, that's sort of what we had in the United States post 3 Mile Island. We had we had that. So this gentleman,
Take two more.
here and here.
I would like to get your impression. It's my understanding that about 2 billion of people on the planet have no regular access to electricity. And I guess my question would be, do you have any vision into whether the Chinese reactors will be cheap enough to where people in the developing world will be able to buy them to be able to get out of the oppressive energy scarcity that currently oppresses them? Is there any hope that those reactors in that region will be cheap enough for them to choose?
You know, I'm not an energy guru, but I see the solution to, in China, yes, in the Middle East, in North Africa, but I see distributed generation, solar, fuel cell, substantial storage to be the solution to many of those people's lack of power. They are, but nuclear is a very expensive technology too. And you can make smaller scale investment choices to, put solar panels in African villages with batteries than you can to build a nuclear plant someplace in the middle of Central Africa. There was one other, yes.
You mentioned that safety and I think it was utilization factor increase hand in hand. If I had that right, can you
Yes.
tell me why?
Because if you have operational problems all the time, those are probably indicators of lack of care, and they are probably, if they're not caught and corrected right away, they're probably potential accidents waiting to happen. If you have a culture where every glitch, you not only anticipate problems and solve them, solve them before they become problems, but if there's a warning signal or an indicator or a precursor of something that is beginning to be a problem, you get on it and you solve it, and you don't have any downtime. That's the kind of operating philosophy, and that is a safety culture. And that kind of operating philosophy means you're not only going to be operating safer, you're going to go from 83% to 93%. The plant's going to stay up and running. And so I think that my proposition is that I believe most nuclear operators would say this, that the two really very much go hand in hand.
And on that note, why don't we get George to
Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.